And we've got a fantastic panel today. I've asked them each to give us sort of 5 or 6 minutes about their own stories so that I don't encapsulate that too much for you. But I just wanted to highlight why Annie and I really decided to ask these very talented people to be here today. And so I'll start at the end with Sarah Price, who is an adult endocrinologist, a very inspirational young clinician scientist. And I heard that she's juggling all the things that women at this level of their career have to juggle, and also making her way in the endocrine world. Next we have Piero Peruka, who I work with quite closely as an epileptologist. I'm paediatric and Piero is adult, but our worlds collide regularly in a million ways in terms of genetics and semiology and all sorts of things in epilepsy. And Piero is really interesting because he's travelled the world and ended up in Melbourne and done his PhD in Melbourne, but had a fascinating journey here and is now an associate professor at Monash and a bit at Melbourne, I think, or Melbourne and a bit at Monash, or everything really. Sebastian King is a surgeon and an academic surgeon, and he's actually a mentee of the Academy, so in our formal mentorship program of people who are going to be leaders in our community, and he's already well on his way, and a fascinating story as a paediatric surgeon. And Sylvie Minh next to me is currently my fellow, so it's a bit like Annie and Ewan. She can't say it all, honestly, I'm sure, but there you go. She's from Berlin, and she's here for a year or two and I asked her to come because, so she's a paediatric neurologist like I am, but I asked her to come to say, you know, why would I come to Australia? What's the reason? And I think you should think about those issues for when you want to go overseas. And I think it's incredibly important to look outside Australia. Australia is parochial and we're small. And as you can see, we've got great people, but you really can't get a world view by just being in Australia. So Sylvie's going to give us the other end of that. So maybe we'll start with you, Sarah.
No. Yes.
So my name's Sarah Price. I'm an adult endocrinologist and obstetric medicine physician. I felt very reassured today listening to some of the earlier speakers because my path was quite checkered. I quite liked the idea of being a clinician scientist when I was in medical school, but also wanted family, etc., and it all sat very uncomfortably with me. I deliberately sought out mentors when I was going through my residency. I have to say the advice that I got was probably not ideal in retrospect. It was basically you have to choose between the two. I ended up having 2 children before I sat my physician's exam. So I sat my physician's exam with 2 children under 2. And then had a 3rd child in my 3rd year of residency. If I was to look back, possibly I chose mentors that I shouldn't have, but all has turned out well in the end. I did my PhD with Joe Perucca, and in terms of how to choose a great supervisor, just look for a great person is my advice. And finished my PhD, and now I'm doing a postdoc. I work in 4 different hospitals, and I just love it and wouldn't want it to be different, but I did have a bit of a checkered path. I did DipObs, Diploma of Child Health, a few different things. I've taken lots of years off, had a year studying American literature. I spent a year in Africa just because I could, and it's all been great, yes.
Probably. Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Piero Peruka, and I'm an adult neurologist, in fact, with an interest in epilepsy. Ingrid, or Professor Sheffer, I'd say, has asked me to give you sort of an overview of my journey, which is probably not as exciting as Sarah's. But so I did my medical training in Italy, in a small town not far away from Milan. And then I did my neurology training there as well. And during my neurology training, I spent a year in New York City, which I'm very fond of New York, but I also met my wife. So I did take something away from New York. And I would say that I told my wife, let's move back to Italy, and she was very excited to move close to Milan. But then I said, what about moving to Canada? And she agreed, despite the weather. And we spent 3 years in Montreal at the Montreal Neurological Institute, where I did my first epilepsy fellowship at the Montreal Neurological Institute with Jean Gottman and Francois Dubois. And then moved to Melbourne, work in a very collaborative environment, and moved to do a clinical PhD, so an epilepsy fellowship and a PhD. I would say the main reason for moving to Melbourne and doing a PhD was that I don't think there's any place like Melbourne when it comes to epilepsy. This is a unique environment that puts together, I think, the greatest minds today in epilepsy. One is sitting on the other side of the speaker podium, but there's many other colleagues who have really transformed our understanding of epilepsy. So as a young clinician researcher trying to learn and come here to Melbourne, I think there was no other opportunity to be able to learn as much as coming here. And it's been a tremendous opportunity. I had lots of fun, which I think it's the key recipe when it comes to training, and I still have fun today. So I am now an associate professor, but also a clinician. I work at Royal Melbourne, at the Alfred, but also do a lot of my research at Austin Health. And I do travel a lot within Melbourne, but I do believe in collaborations. I think this is really a key ingredient in 2019 to advance science, to advance our understanding of different conditions, including epilepsy. So that's me.
Yeah. Is this working? Yes. So as Ingrid says, I'm a surgeon, academic surgeon. They do exist. But I had no intention ever of being an academic surgeon. I haven't travelled as far, travelled from Sydney, but echo Piero's thoughts in saying that from a research and a collaborative point of view, that Melbourne, not just from an epilepsy point of view, but from a paediatric and paediatric surgical point of view, is really a mecca for research, not only in Australia but internationally. So I did my medical training in Sydney, and did my early intern and resident years in New South Wales, but knew that I wanted to do something with a research focus. I didn't quite know what that was, and I got some excellent advice because I was initially going to do 1 year. I got some excellent advice from one of the professors from Adelaide, actually, a surgical professor there, who said, well, if you want to go anywhere from a research perspective, then doing a PhD is what you want to do. And I'm old enough that where most of the medical students around the country at that time were doing MBBSs, so that the MD was not really present at that stage. And so I'd said, well, what about doing an MD versus a PhD? And again, his advice was, well, if you're going to go overseas, and particularly if you're going to go to North America, everybody's an MD. And they won't see that your 2 years in research is different to the MD that they've done at medical school. And on top of that, that third year is really where you take off and your exponential increase in the publishing and in your understanding and also your expertise in that field. So I took a bit of a punt and a bit of a gamble and said, right, I'm going to do paediatric surgical research at the Children's, moved down here. Not knowing if I was going to get into paediatric surgery, but it all worked out in the end, and got selected into paediatric surgery. Now, for paed surg, you actually have to do quite a lot of travel, so I ended up training in Victoria, in New South Wales, in Queensland, and in New Zealand, but ended up, after a relatively tortuous path, to be back at the Children's as the senior registrar, and then stayed as a consultant. And then had, throughout that time, the advantage of doing my PhD early was that I was able to continue with my research, piecemeal, but while I was doing my training as well. And it also meant that it honed my particular interest in, and I've ended up as a paediatric colorectal surgeon, which is reasonably super specialised. I still do general paediatric surgery when I'm on call. I'm on call this weekend, and this morning saw an incredible variety of patients, from tiny little babies through to children in the intensive care unit with lymphatic malformations of the abdomen, through to sort of bog standard appendicitis patients. But Most of the bulk of my elective work is now congenital colorectal conditions, so Hirschsprung's disease and babies born without a bottom, perforate anus. And part of that pathway was also then going and spending time in Canada. So I went to Sick Kids and did my neonatal surgical fellowship over there 4 or 5 years ago. But now, well and truly back in Melbourne, and despite family being up in Sydney, Melbourne is the place to be.
Yeah, and I'm Sylvie. I came all the way from Berlin in Germany to do my pediatric neurology fellowship with Ingrid at the Austin Hospital. And I think a lot of Melburnians have asked me, why did you end up in Melbourne? It's just the opposite side of the world. And the story goes a little bit back, and I was a first-year resident actually back in Berlin, and went to a conference of the German Neurology Society, and Ingrid received a prize there. I think it was in Nhmrc in Austria, and I was like, wow, this is. And then I started reading up a little bit about her on that day. I was like, this is really inspiring. And I remember thinking, yeah, maybe one day I can just go and train with her or do. I didn't think about fellowships at that day, but research or whatever project was quite undefined at that time. And yeah, here I am. So can actually happen. And I'm training in pediatric neurology, and I'm doing that as a clinician scientist. We have that in Berlin as a combined program where you do 50% of your time in clinic and the other 50% in research. And I think it was a bit of coincidence that I landed there. I've always had an interest in science, but it was also the chance, or was being lucky, that my mentor somehow saw something and thought, okay, you could just try and do 3 months of basic science in the lab and see how you go. And I thought, yeah, well, why not? Let's just try it. And I ended up really liking the environment and liking the way basic scientists from all different directions think, and how you could combine this with clinical medicine. And then I applied for that program and did my clinician scientist 3-year program, and afterwards applied for that scholarship to do a fellowship abroad and do clinic and research. That's why I ended up here.
Just tell them a few sentences about the research project, because we've heard a lot about randomised controlled trials.
Yeah. So what I've been doing in Berlin is a bit different, and just to get the bigger picture, I did more of basic science research with animal models, working with mice, trying to figure out how a gene that we discovered as pathogenic in a few of our patients actually functions. And so really wet lab science. And I thought I really like it. But I think what really inspires me about science is more the thinking process rather than doing the actual thing. And I wanted to get to know a different side of science as well. And I wanted to stay in genetics and wanted to get to know more about epilepsy. And so that's why I found Ingrid Scheffer and her collaborator Sam Berkowitz and read about their papers and thought, okay, they seem to have really interesting ideas, and I want to see how they work, what the environment is there, how they can be so productive in what they do, and became the scientists they are now. And when I came here, we're doing more of clinical research at the moment, different projects in epilepsy. Some are more about defining new epilepsy syndromes and their characteristics, so very clinical. And the other ones are more in the direction of precision medicine, trying to figure out, or where we have identified the pathological mechanism behind that disease, what we can do precisely to make the life of the patients better, or to help the disease process.
All right, so please take the opportunity. Oh, good idea. Take the opportunity to ask some questions. Do we have any burning questions? Yes, thanks. At the back there. We have 2 very able microphone runners who are looking forward to running around. You got sound? We don't have the mic. Thanks. Try again. Do you want Mikey? Yeah, just give the other one.
All right, thank you all for coming today. My question is for all of the panel. So I think today we got a very good idea about why a clinician should do science as well to develop their skills. And but I have kind of the opposite question. So what if someone is a scientist? What would be the reasons that they would want to be a clinician as well? So what are the benefits to it? And if you agree to it as well.
Fabulous question.
To be honest, clinicians and scientists collaborate often on projects. The one thing that clinician scientists have is perspective. So to be able to take a concept and, because possibly the most interesting questions are ones that come from the patient. So I don't understand how this works, or why does this happen to me? And so those questions ultimately will probably be answered by scientists and basic scientists, but then that information has to be translated into clinical medicine. And clinician scientists fill that brief. So for my interest is really in obesity, and obesity in a pregnancy context, and about intergenerational metabolic disease. So it does take a broad array of people working together to answer that question, and ultimately science will be about collaboration. But I think that in order to put it in a clinical context and be able to answer a patient's question, it probably does take clinician scientists.
I completely agree, actually. Along those lines, may I just say that I'll just present you with a case of having basic scientists who are not clinicians, and then just clinicians who are not scientists. And you have two groups of people who are talking two different languages. And ultimately, basic scientists want to answer a clinically relevant question, but not everyone has that insight into what a patient goes through, what the clinical problem actually is. They may be very good in understanding the mechanisms. So how to elevate that knowledge and taking that increased understanding into the patient? Well, you can complement that by being a clinician. The other way, as Sarah suggested, is to work for a basic scientist to work closely with a clinician. So when I was in Montreal, I had two mentors. One was a scientist, not a clinician, very smart scientist who understood clinical problems very well. But my other mentor was a clinician. And so they worked very well together because they complemented each other. And that synergy is really the key for all their success. So I think when you see both sides of the world, then you understand the problem better, but also you have the methodology, the scientific rigor to tackle that clinically relevant question better. So I think that's a great advantage of merging the two worlds.
I think that I agree absolutely that from a surgical perspective, often surgeons are just seen as the providers of tissue for basic scientists, be that resecting a little bit of tissue from the brain for epilepsy, through to a bit of the placenta, through to a bit of the bowel, and I'm always fascinated to take your question to think about the basic scientists who are focused on a condition that I spent a lot of time on, which is Hirschsprung's disease. Hirschsprung's disease, babies are born without nerves at the very end of the bowel, and they get a bowel obstruction and can get very unwell with that, and they need an operation to manage that. But there's a huge amount of basic science done by scientists who've never been in an operating theatre on the field of Hirschsprung's disease, because it's a really beautiful model for stem cell therapy for the bowel, in terms of taking a condition that has no nerves and being able to put stem cells in to replace those nerves. And so that's part of the work that I'm doing with collaborators at University of Melbourne and internationally. But most of those colleagues of mine have never been into an operating theatre. And so relatively recently I'd said to our collaborators, both at Monash and at Melbourne, that you should come in while I'm doing the surgery. Because one, you're taking that sample anyway, but it's good to meet the family and good to see what we do, and then also get a perspective of all these operations that they often talk about, but have actually never seen. And I think that can't but help inform the decisions that they make in terms of the research they're doing. Back to Sarah's point, that these are questions that are driven, in my case, mostly by the parents. The children are too young to ask these questions, but why has this happened? How will it happen? Will it happen again to my family? What does this mean long term?
I just wanted to explore a little bit more. You're a scientist and thinking about doing medicine? Is that the sort of idea?
And thank you. Because the project that we're doing is very translational and could potentially lead to a clinical trial in a few years. We collaborate with a lot of clinicians and surgeons and research nurses. So I hear a lot about medicine every day in my research, and I was thinking of going into the next level after that. But I've never sort of asked the question, going through this pathway, like first doing the PhD and then do the medicine.
Yeah, look, I think that's increasingly common. I think it will open up your career hugely. And I don't think, it's hard to say that to scientists because they feel a bit compromised, I guess. But when you have a medical degree, it changes the grants you go for, it changes your credibility for thinking about medical issues. It changes your paycheck, which is nice. But it does create a whole lot of other demands you've heard about today. But I think it does, one of the most important things is it helps you to ask the right questions. And Sarah was getting to exactly that point. And the problem with basic science is that sometimes people will spend their lifetime asking a question that may not be important, which has been a recurrent theme all day. So I think if you're thinking about it, if it's enticing you a bit, I would give it very serious thought because you'll be an even better clinician scientist with a PhD. So, some more questions? Thanks.
I'm currently a medical student, and I guess I wanted to ask if you were able to provide some practical tips of how a medical student can get involved in research. Because I'm mindful of the fact that a lot of the talks today have been about PhDs and whatnot, but I guess how as a medical student and as an intern and resident, how do I get involved in research?
So medical school, I think, should be about meeting and greeting. So when you go to meetings, you afterwards, the afternoon and lunch sessions are really to meet people and find out whether you like people and you want to pursue these jobs. But certainly as a medical student, there were friendly people that I was able to publish with, and then decided that, yes, I really like these people. I could spend a career pursuing this. But equally, I think it's really important to potentially go to meetings and find that actually this isn't what you thought it was, and this isn't something I want to spend time pursuing. So research and medical school, it should just go hand in hand, meet people, they will invite you to collaborate. And I agree with what Ewan said, just say yes to everything and see how it turns out.
But Sarah, can you just talk a little bit about med students when they come up and ask you to do a project? Do you take them on? What do you do?
I think, so you certainly, you want to truly be willing to follow through. So nobody wants medical students to come up and say, I'll do your project, and next week they're doing something else. And obviously you are there to finish medical school. But if you are genuinely interested in the area and you've read around the topic and you've got something you want to do and you've met somebody who is potentially working in that area, you should meet people with your own ideas, semi-well developed, about what you may be interested in. I don't think it's good to go and say, hey, I want to do a research project, tell me what project, I should do, tell me how to do it, etc. So you want to have thought it out well, and if you are going to meet with somebody, do the obvious things, turn up on time, pre-read, know who the person is you're talking to, etc. Yeah, but you want eager, keen people. Yeah.
I completely agree. I mean, I can give you an example of a medical student who I'm working with. I think, as you said, Sarah, it's really about meet and greet. And so I gave a lecture at the University of Melbourne on epilepsy. And he came after the lecture and asked a few questions. And so I invited him to join my clinic. So he would understand epilepsy hands-on. And I have a couple of clinics for seizures and epilepsy. And by staying at the clinic, attending the clinic, and observing, seeing how we interact with patients, what patients go through, which is a lot, from getting a diagnosis to managing their condition, he spontaneously actually came up with a few very, very good questions. And so we're pursuing that in a research setting. But to Sarah's point, is not the book doesn't give you all the answers. And this is, I think, in a way links to the previous question. How do you combine a clinically relevant question with the right methodology? And so understand the patient, understand the clinical setting, and then the right questions will come up spontaneously, even at the medical school level. So I think, if anything, your mind and your brain is more predisposed to ask questions. You're younger, you don't have any preconception, I would say, and so I would certainly invite you to ask questions, meet a lecturer, and see if you can be involved gradually into a research project.
Yeah, I was going to say, you just have to be mindful that if you're going to take something on, that it needs to be completed, because you and I'm as much this happens to me as much as it does to anybody else, but bearing in mind that if you say that you're going to do something, you want to make sure that you follow it through. And so my advice would be to take one job on at a time. And particularly if you're the one that's initiating that, then pick that and run with that and complete it. Because a couple of things: one, there's a huge amount of satisfaction in completing it. Two, you don't want to be the medical student that's walking down the corridor at the hospital sort of doing this because you're about to see your supervisor who you haven't responded to that email for the last 6 weeks because she or he's said, oh, what's happening with that data? And if you then take that out of medical, because I often get asked by medical students going into intern, what should I do research-wise in intern year? And my advice, and it's just my advice, is to be the best intern you can be. And that means focusing on honing your clinical skills, being reliable as an intern, because you don't want to be the intern who is leaving early or not completing their clinical tasks because you've got a meeting with so-and-so that you've got to get to at the end of the day, or you're so busy trying to do the data collection from the job, from the project you were doing 6 months ago, that impacts on how well you do your intern work. Because your intern colleagues and your intern supervisors, they won't really care much about whether or not your project, previous research project's going well. They'll care that you're doing your job well, and that you're not dumping on your colleagues and leaving early. So I think that's just my take on making sure you take the right tasks on board.
Can I make a comment about that, just in particularly with regards to going through and having children? The only person, from my perspective, the only person that really knows whether you can do the task is you. So going through some of my training, people said, oh, well, look, you've got 2 children, how are you going to pass the exam? I had no doubt that, I can sit there, pass the exam. I had no doubt. I was willing to put in 130% effort. But would I recommend that for somebody else? Well, I just think that the only person that knows whether you are going to show up to work on time, whether you are going to meet your deadlines, is you. And so often, for all the advice that you get from many people, it really is about having a look at yourself and are you willing to give up, certain things in order to meet the deadlines? Because I agree, you want to do a job and you want to finish well and know that people are really proud of the effort you've put in. But don't sell yourself short, but just have, a think about, am I going to do this job and do it well? Yeah, but don't let other people's views of you shape that.
I'm just going to add a couple of comments there, despite saying I wouldn't say much, which is, we all get a lot of med students coming up super enthusiastic. They come back once or twice and we never see them again. And you then got an idea that you've given them that you don't know if they're doing anything with it, so it gets lost. And you get frustrated, and as I thought you ably put it, they do that if they see you. And I don't usually nag the med students because I'm just simply too busy. But I do get worry when someone comes to me now and I go, are you really going to do this in my head? Can I give you the project the last person defaulted on? So I think do one thing and do it well and get a paper out of it, because that's going to help you go further. But concentrate on becoming a good clinician. It's a whole different skill set, and the other can come later. The other thing was a slightly different view to Sarah's about picking the project. And I refer you to Ronaldo Bellomo's talk at this conference 2 years ago, which is online. And we brought him back in the first and the second year because it's a phenomenal talk about how you pick a project. And the bottom line is you can't, because you don't have enough sophistication and depth of understanding. And that's what we're there for, is my view. So I want someone to come along and say to me, I'd like to do something in this space. And then I'll say, well, depending on the time frame, med student, a very simple question is all that you can address. A real research project is 3 years of PhD. And that's when you learn how really to think like a researcher. But a taste is fantastic. But you have to pick the right project, and you can't do that. But I can suggest that to you, and then you can go away and become a world expert in it, which is why I tell my parents when we find a gene. All right, enough of me. Yes, please, over here. Annie, thank you. I feel bad now I've got this mic. Is the other mic working? Oh, we've got two out there.
Hi, so I'm currently a medical student I've completed my honours this year, and I've really enjoyed it, considering going on and doing a PhD. I understand that all of you on the panel have all done your PhDs later in your careers, and I was just hoping to get your opinions on doing it later and how you found that.
Well, it works very different in Germany. We start earlier with a little MD PhD, which is probably about your stage. Often they're still medical students, or they're early residents, interns maybe, and do that about 2-3 years, but they do that part-time during their training. And I think either way can work if you're really dedicated. Just be realistic about your aims and be realistic about your time and plan it well, because I think clinical training takes a lot of time and it's a huge task on its own. And then doing research only in the evening probably might not work so well. So you have to somehow have a plan, a time scheme, how you can fit both well in if you want to do it.
Just a comment. I did it later after my clinical training. Can you hear me? Yeah. To Ingrid's point, I mean, the reason for doing it after my neurology training and my first fellowship is that I wanted to become a good clinician first. And so you may be able to squeeze in during your clinical training a small research project, as everyone I think has said, as long as you're committed. But taking on a PhD is a major endeavor, and it requires a lot of effort. And I don't personally. For me at least, it was an endeavor on its own. So I did my clinical training, focused on being the best clinical physician I can be, and then realized I really wanted to pursue an academic career, and the PhD is a prerequisite for that. And I wanted to do it well. So that's why I did it later in my career.
I think it also depends to some degree what type of specialty you are interested in, because I did mine earlier than most, in that I'd done my intern and resident year and went into the 3 years and did essentially almost no clinical work, just a bit of resident cover at the hospital. And that was mostly just to earn a little bit of extra cash and get to know people around the hospital. That made a huge difference in terms of the research I was doing, because it was largely clinically based. But for somebody who knew that they wanted to be a proceduralist, there is a huge advantage to doing your research early, because yes, you might not know exactly what the topic of interest and expertise you're going to develop. As it turns out, I've ended up going into that area because I really enjoyed it in my PhD work. But you're taking a bit of a punt, as I said, but your ability to then go and do your clinical training and surgical training and learn your surgical skills over 6 or 7 or 8 years, and then continue to do your research throughout that. For me, it worked very well. My wife is a immunologist at Royal Melbourne, and she, along with our 3 children and sort of juggling all of those various demands, has done it the other way and is just finishing her PhD at WEHI at the moment. And for her, it was great because she was able to, she knew that she was interested in the genetics of immunodeficiencies, and so therefore has been able to work both as a consultant. But as a consultant immunologist, she can do 1 day a week, and if she goes to enough meetings and enough clinics, then she maintains her clinical skills without losing her procedural skill. Whereas if you're a surgeon who finishes their training and then goes and does a 3-year PhD, then all of a sudden you take a step back on the procedural ability. So it does depend to some degree what you want to do long term.
I guess mine, I probably just happened by default, was doing medical school, and then subsequently did a PhD. But when I did my PhD, I did it full time. Mine took 5 years, but I did it full time. But I think in the first couple of years, I really just wanted to spend time around people that were really good at what they do. So aside from finishing the PhD, obviously, I really wanted to learn how they developed their questions and how they approached it. And I think having been in a clinical setting, it does give you some perspective about then looking back and seeing how the questions are formulated and how people conduct themselves and what meetings they go to. So for me, I felt like it was a time of sort of apprenticeship with people that I really respected and wanted to be like.
And I feel strongly that a clinical research PhD is much better once you're a clinician, because when you're a junior person, you don't really even understand your specialty. Once you're a fully developed specialist, or in the last few years of your advanced training of adult medicine or paediatric medicine, and this is very different to surgical world, which I completely agree with what you've said. I think that you can do a much higher level PhD, like Piero has completed. You only completed a couple of years ago, didn't you? And, he did some beautiful work because he brought amazing expertise. And in lots of ways, I think we beat the American system by a mile there, because they do MD PhDs. And so they're doing their PhD before they have any clinical skills. So they come away with probably good science background, probably stronger science background, but they then don't really understand clinical research. And Australia is great at clinical research, which I hope you've gleaned today. More questions? Well, there are 2. Okay, there.
Thanks to the panel for sharing your stories. I'd just like to ask if you can share what are the important steps or things to consider after your PhD to getting to where you are today?
Well, I'm in the thick of that at the moment. Probably so Joe Perucca was my supervisor for my PhD, and definitely in the final 12 months, he was sending me to places to talk to people. So to set up, in my last year of my PhD, to set up a postdoc. And I think we met almost every week, and he asked me every week what was my plan, and it was very methodical. And I was his 23rd, 24th PhD student, so obviously he had done it before, but that is the value of having a really experienced PhD supervisor. But so the end of my PhD and the start of my postdoc was sort of seamless. And then I think he has set me up with a number of things to do over the next 3-4 years in terms of writing grants, project ideas, people to collaborate with, etc. But I was very conscious that many people finish their PhD and then fall off what they call the PhD cliff, so never to do research again, and I very much don't want to be one of those people. So I think possibly a lot of discussions with people, but particularly guidance with my PhD supervisor.
Still have the microphone. We always agree, but the reality is you want to start thinking about what you want to do next as you're finishing your PhD. Let's say the last year. So you need to start entertaining those conversations regarding and asking yourself, what do I want to do? And that's where also the supervisor needs to guide you and potentially connect you to the right people. You can't get to the very end not knowing what's next, because in those final 12 months, you want to start getting the ideas that may be ideas for grants, applications, which may prepare you for the postdoctoral phase of your career. And here I have two perspectives. One is the Australian perspective, and the other one is the North American perspective. I'll start with the North American perspective. So often in North America, when you're finishing your PhD, they usually encourage you to start looking for a postdoc position in a different lab or in a different group. Often in a different country, because there's a lot to gain from getting a completely different experience compared to where you did your PhD. And in Australia, I think it's a bit different. You may have the opportunity of staying, especially for clinicians. I think clinician scientists, often you may have the opportunity of staying where you did your PhD and sort of continue on or build on what you have started during your PhD. In any case, I think you need to start preparing and get your ideas going and get prepared in those last 12 months of your PhD, thinking, what will I be doing next? Some people may not want to be an academic, for example, and that's something I think that deserves maybe a separate conversation. They may get to the end of the PhD and say, look, I don't want to be an academic. Not everyone who does a PhD will become an academic, and so it's important to have those conversations with your supervisor. It's really, really important. Supervisors sometimes.
Again, it also depends on what time, Sharman's my PhD student, so so it depends on what stage also you're doing your training, because I think to the reflection that I had, that I finished my PhD and then went into my first surgical registrar job, and all I was interested in was how to tie a knot, literally, and could I do that? And God help the trauma page go off. So that was my response. And then I compare it to what my wife's going through at the moment, where we won't, we won't have an opportunity to do a postdoc overseas. She would normally have done that. But all those discussions are happening with her supervisors to say, right, this is where you should be presenting, this is where you should be aiming for your next grant. I hadn't appreciated, having done my PhD early, that so many of the funding opportunities sort of disappear because those early career fellowships, so many of them are based on when you finished your PhD. And even though there's sort of slight room for movement about that, there's not really much to, you can say, yes, I went off and did surgical training or physician training for 6 or 7 years, but a lot of those opportunities disappear, which I hadn't appreciated at the time. But I suppose that's probably why I didn't have the discussion that I had with my mentor, because he was working hard to make sure I got onto the surgical program.
There's another question. I think you were next.
Thank you. My question is probably directed more towards Professor Sebastian King. Seeing that most of the speakers today are from physician background, I'm just wondering if it is more challenging to be a clinician scientist as a surgeon, and how is it different? How is your work as a clinician scientist different from those from the medical background?
Yeah, it's a good question. There certainly are a number of surgeons around the country and internationally that are academic. There obviously are many. But I think there are a number of factors that lead to it not being as strong in surgery as it is in physician practice. I think that to be brutally honest, for many it's financial, that there is a significant remuneration difference between being a surgeon with a busy private practice versus doing an academic career. And so you see that less in the States and in Canada, for example, where people are paid relatively similar amount of money based on whether they're academic, and sometimes more if they're publishing more. And so that's one, I think that's one aspect. There's also an element of the fact that I need to do a certain, most of us need to do a certain amount of our skill to keep our skill base and to continue to improve on that. And so that means a number of sessions a week that you've got to be operating. And you don't, as a surgeon, all of us are blessed with a relatively healthy ego, but you want to make sure that you're doing that job well. And I don't want to compromise the patient that I'm operating on because I'm off writing a paper, because that patient doesn't care whether or not I've got another paper published. That patient and that family care about whether or not that operation goes well. But I think that there are great opportunities within surgery for that reason. And the problem is that there aren't as many good mentors around. And so you have to be sort of specific about how you pick those mentors. And that's, as Ingrid mentioned before, I'm blessed to be one of the current mentees within the Academy program. And when Ingrid and I were first chatting on the phone, one of the things I'd put down is I didn't want to be mentored by a surgeon. In fact, I wanted to be mentored by somebody within the department, within the University of Melbourne, because that's the university that I exist in, but was a non-surgeon. One, because I felt that I could access surgeons relatively easily, but two, I wanted a different, perspective on research. But I think that I'm blessed because the position that I'm at, one, I'm at the Children's Hospital, which has a very strong academic flavour. My previous PhD supervisor is still the Professor of Surgery at the Children's, so it's been a very strong supporter for me, and he's getting close to retirement. It's been helping sort of that transition. But also financially, the hospital's got quite a lot of money in the foundation which supports research. And so that makes that, has made that transition into academia a bit easier.
The young lady here has been very patient.
I'm sorry, I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. First of all, I've been set on research for a while now, but I don't really want to have to do it until I've decided on my specialty. But I have heard from quite a few people that it's difficult to get onto a program unless you've got papers published. Is that true at all?
I think it all depends on which program that you're talking about. So I think that would be very different between programs, whether it's surgical, medical, etc. I mean, certainly a publication does tell a lot about a person. So it tells you that that person is a finisher. So they've done a project to completion. But I wouldn't say that it's hard to say whether it's an absolute. I mean, obviously, if there are many people vying for a position and one person is very well published and the other person isn't, but I guess at the end of the day, they're clinical roles. And so what we want is somebody who is an excellent clinician and will look after their patients. I mean, that's the job you're applying for, so that would be a priority. But publications do speak about the person.
May I ask you, are you a medical school or in?
Yeah, I am.
I was talking to Terry O'Brien, who heads the Department of Neuroscience at Monash University. It's tricky these days because there are many very, very, very good students who have already some publications. And often what separates one person from going into even neurology training from another one is a track record with publications. At least that's one element that may contribute. Certainly, if one applies for a PhD scholarship, for example, which I think is an important element to consider because you want to have a bit of money while you're doing your PhD, as well as doing some clinical work, but to be competitive for a scholarship, publications certainly are are important. And they just give you the edge against other applicants, and especially if it's a high quality publication. It's not just a number. I think it's important to always strive for really good quality publications.
I think it's also, to a large degree, the fact that if you've done that research, you might have written the abstract, you might have had the opportunity to present, that then if you're interested in that particular field, then the people who are potentially interviewing you and that you're applying to those positions have actually seen the work that you've done, or you've had an opportunity to go and talk to them in a way that's more personal. And going back to Sarah's point about going and meeting people at meetings, going up and talking to people, because there's no, I got onto paediatric surgery, and I know that essentially everybody that interviewed me for the training position I had met at a previous stage presenting at various conferences. And I think that not only made me more at ease because I knew all the people, but also I was a known quantity. And so I think that's an advantage of having done that work as long as you've completed it. Because again, you're not going to turn up to that interview, and if you're doing that, if the person across the table is looking at you thinking, well, you never got back to me with that Excel spreadsheet that you said you would, then you might struggle to get on to that job.
And just a little comment around the Nhmrc post-medical scholarships, which are what you get to do your PhD, and they're quite prestigious. They have a relatively high success rate of 33% or something, which is much better than most of the grants. And they're now designed to be, you have to be 5 years post your degree. So they're actually designed for medical people to be able to go and specialise and then go and do that, which I did one a long time ago, but the income was so poor that I was a tax deduction on my husband's income. Your second question.
Yep. Sorry, let me just think about it. So if you're interested in a project, but the only people doing it are people who are just scientists, not clinicians, is it worthwhile, or is there a disadvantage to having a supervisor who is not also a clinician?
From my humble position, I would say to find a bridge. So find people that may not have exactly, so you can certainly have a science as a supervisor, but maybe have multiple supervisors, and somebody who has a clinician, potentially not with the exact area of interest, but somebody who would be willing to supervise you and provide the clinical perspective would be my advice.
I completely agree. I mean, I think it's always important to have a clinician as part of your supervisor, whether that's a clinician researcher, even better, but it gives you a perspective into the clinical problem, which I assume may be the main area of your degree. And so without that perspective, I think you'll be lacking a big element. And so I think it's critical to have a clinician among your supervisors.
I think it also helps you to stay connected with the clinical world. If you have a clinical supervisor, so even if there wasn't one at the beginning, you can maybe propose that and look for someone who might be interested or has collaborated with them before.
Okay. Sorry, is it okay if I ask to clarify, what does it mean to have multiple supervisors? Is that within the same lab or within the same project?
I'll let these guys answer that in a moment, but I just wanted to share an anecdote. My son, who was here before but has left, he did his BMed Sci from Monash. He went to Oxford and went to a dame's laboratory, a physiology laboratory, and the laboratory had 10 international postdocs in Oxford, and he was called Physician Eddie, and he was really the lowest form of life because, he was just a medical student and everyone else was a real scientist. And they gave him a pretty hard time, and his frog egg cells died every week, and he's got some papers out of it. He had a fantastic experience, but it was a bit rough there for a while, I think, not having the physician bridge, but still a very good learning curve. Now, what was your next question? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, just what the answers were. What does it mean to have several supervisors, and how does that work?
So, for example, when I was coming up to thinking about a PhD, there was nobody specific I sort of had an idea of the project I wanted to do, but it needed an obesity person, it needed an obstetric person, it needed a basic scientist. And so you basically put together a team of people who will supervise you. And so there'll be a primary supervisor who is your go-to person, but then you need multiple other people who can provide perspective. So it might be, you need a basic scientist, you need an obstetrician, and they basically work together as a team to finish whatever project is your PhD project.
Most of the time, that team will be set up, so Sarah's perspective of having sort of bringing that group together, then that's great. But most of the time, people will, the supervisor will have that. But that being said, when I did my PhD, the previous MD student had spent a little bit of time in a motility lab up in Sydney, but I ended up going and spending a lot of time and developing a relationship with one of the scientists there that's still going 15 years later, and we have a strong relationship. He does colonic work, but because of him now do the work that we do with the esophagus as well. So I think the student has the opportunity also to enhance those collaborations between the different basic science and clinicians.
I mean, the team is sort of forms itself as you move forward with your candidature. So I had multiple supervisors. My main supervisor understood that I would benefit from having additional co-supervisors. Additional supervisors, so they're co-supervisors, to succeed with to have success with my projects. And multiple supervisors can give you a complementary input into your project, and ultimately that's best for you. It's always good to have not too many. But that we'll get into a different discussion there. So I had 3, for example. I didn't have Ingrid, otherwise we've been very close, close collaborators. Almost you were almost a supervisor. But as I said at the beginning, I believe in collaborations, and nowadays it's very difficult to just have one student and one supervisor. You can't just do it on your own, and multiple people. It's multiple heads. They bring something to the table, and I do believe in that.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the pearls of wisdom so far. So my question is, we know that not all research go through to completion. So if, let's say, we are not the one leading the project, we are just asked to contribute our time and effort for the project, how can we ensure that the project go through to completion? Because personally, I've been involved in 2 where I've contributed enormous time and effort, but it just got stopped because the principal investigator just didn't have the interest to continue. So how do we react or ensure that it
Here's
comes
your
up
question, Sarah.
Okay, well, here's my humble answer. So some projects fall down because perhaps they weren't set up well to begin with, but you probably do learn something along the way. And so if you have genuinely set out and put a lot of effort into a project, you've learned something along the way, and often that something will be valuable to other research groups that have the same idea and fall down at the same step. So I don't think anything's a dismal failure. There's always learning out of it somewhere, so it's about picking the important learning point out of it. And sometimes people do run out of steam, and I think that probably takes honesty, and it's whether the team can be reformed and restart and, start again. But I guess that's where your supervisors will guide you. Yeah.
In the setting of a PhD, I can give you my personal experience. So in my first year of PhD, I started or set up 4 different projects. Of those, only 3 survived at the end of the first year. But the first year is sort of setting up the project, testing the waters. Not everything will necessarily come to completion, and you have to accept that. There might be multiple hurdles, and some have been outlined by Sarah. It's important that you have other parallel projects that are maybe less risky than, not as risky as that one, or safer. So I think it's a major responsibility of your supervisor to be able to guide you through that first year and guide you through the process, and also perhaps having an early conversation. This is what happened to me. An honest, frank conversation at the very beginning, saying, look, not all of these projects may come to completion. And I think once you accept that and you come on board, you still put your effort, but you at least know that you have other projects if that particular project doesn't work. At least this is my experience.
And you also don't know whether or not something's really well and truly dead. It's amazing how many times you can revive something and how long that lag is as well. So, for example, this week, one of my medical students from 2015, so 4 years ago, had 2 papers, first authors, published this week. And that was, and those were papers that we thought were, I knew that they would get there eventually, but he's moved on. He's an orthopaedic, aspiring orthopaedic trainee. But the fact that we've now got these published will make a difference to him applying for his orthopaedic scheme next year. He's got his 2 papers that he needs for the scheme. But those are 4 years down the track, and I'm sure that Ingrid's got a much longer, or maybe not, maybe she doesn't, but but the longest gap between me finishing my PhD and a paper that started within that PhD coming out was about 7 years. Because of the fact that stuff needed to get, last bits got done and then added to, and then there was a change in the way we did stuff, and all of a sudden, so it can take a long time. So you never quite know whether or not that project's gone.
And I got a little bit of a sense that you've done your bit and you're waiting for them to finish now. I mean, that's hard because if you're driving it, that's your problem. But if you're just a middle person, and just is not the right word there, but if you're a middle person, but you can still be in contact with the supervisor and saying, what can I do to help? And if your supervisor is incredibly busy, as I am, the thing that's most useful is if the person books an hour with me and then we sit down and we look at it together, and actually work on that paper, because things do get stuck, but with all different stages. So Sebastian reminded me that a BMed Sci student of mine about 5 years ago, Shu Yu Wang, I think she's now well on her way in physician training, she studied 36 children with a very severe epilepsy, and we've just had the paper accepted to Annals of Neurology with 136 children from all over the world. So it's taken a long time to mature, but I've got a few 10-year papers, and they're good papers. And then I have a whole lot of dead papers, and I had a very talented and ambitious fellow from Canada who came for 2 years. In the 2 years he put out, well, he's been gone now about 2 years, but 21 papers. But he picked up a whole lot of my dead papers. So he didn't do that data collection, but he got them to publication. So it really depends a lot on you as well, I guess, is where I wanted to throw it back. The young lady.
Along those points, I still remember turning up for the first day with Professor John Hudson, who's my mentor and an incredibly prolific academic surgeon. But he had, he's old school, but he had coloured manila folders, and he had about 25 that were sitting off to the side, and they were various projects of various unfinished states. But by the end of my 3 years there, most of those had been recycled. And he'd moved those off, and he had new ones, but they were mostly student. He had a prolific collection of students coming through, but they were, and you knew they were finished because he'd cross them out. He'd reuse the folder, he'd cross out the name and write the next research project on it. But you could see that. I remember sitting there thinking, wow, considering how prolific he is, the fact that he's got this number of projects still sitting there that aren't finished, it was a good reminder to him just to get on and do it.
Just for my impression from this morning's speakers and your own experience, seems like you have to be prepared to travel to move forward and be successful. How do you manage it if you have family and with reduced income and everything to pursue the research?
So my children are now between 6 and 12 years of age, and that was a big consideration for me. I would have loved to do an overseas postdoc, but the reality is that during my PhD I have met and talked to people in both Europe and the States. And there are projects that can be done collaborating with these people, even though you are based in Australia. So I think, in an ideal world, it is beneficial to go overseas, and certainly in my residency, I spent some time overseas. But I think, in an ideal world, that is true. I think young children probably can travel well. We made the decision not for my postdoc not to go overseas, but definitely I am trying to collaborate with these people despite. So now that the internet has been invented, we should use it. And yeah, I think for all of this, you do have to think about there are consequences to travel, there are pros and cons. I have made the decision not to go overseas for my postdoc, but definitely to try, and I will spend periods overseas, but periods at home.
Not a good example here, because what I did, I'm married, I'm still married, and I built a statue in honor of my wife, because we moved 3 continents, as a matter of fact, and she's made tremendous sacrifices to in a way, allow me to have my career, and it's been a lot on her. What I always try to do is always make the time for her. This may be challenging at times because you may travel as part of your work, but she's my number one priority. And so, if I have to choose between work and my family comes first. So that may mean that I may spend an evening with the family and then work afterwards. But you have to be able to, if you want to be successful, you have to be able to make sacrifices, sometimes personal sacrifices.
I think that, looking out at the group here, you're all much younger than me, at least. Your concept of connectivity is completely different from mine. I'm sure I'll learn more from my children's connectivity than I will from anything from myself. But it's a lot easier to do that, to collaborate now, to teleconference effectively now, to use email. That can be pervasive, there can be a problem, but I think in terms of, it's hard to put a price on travelling overseas, because I think it does make a big difference, particularly if you're based in Australia. You can achieve so much more by being in that room, only if it's for a day or two. But the fact that you're present, that you're counted, that you're on the list of people that are in the room, that's really worthwhile. And whether or not you do that as a chunk, go away for a year or two, whether or not you do it as shorter, go for focused periods of time. But the advantage of, I think that we are better trained as clinicians in Australia than pretty much anywhere else, Australasia I'll say, than many other places. And so the advantage that once you've got to the end of your training, physician, surgeon, that concentrated periods of time in centres that do things well, you'll get an enormous amount of value out of those short trips that you don't necessarily need to go for 6 months or a year or 2 years to be able to get that once you're trained.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Piero that you don't with you that you don't have to travel, but because of the connectivity and everything, but you do have to make sacrifices, like Piero said. And one huge advantage, though, to travel, I think, is to get out of your own comfort zone and out of the people that already know you and have an opinion on you and maybe value you and support you, and just start fresh and new and try to make your own way somehow. And it does change you, and I think that's a huge advantage of traveling.
I was going to ask Ingrid a question. What time do you normally do your teleconferences that are international? So are you often getting up at, not going to bed till 12 or 1 because that works with the Americans and the Europeans?
So yeah, Australia's lousy, and particularly when you're not an early person. And I have anaphylaxis to mornings, so it's ghastly. I hate it. And my closest collaborator, Sam Berkovic, loves mornings. So he does 6 a.m. and for Australia, if you're going to do America and Europe, you have to do 6 a.m. and I hate 6 a.m. I can't focus all day. I'm perfect at midnight though, so it's a real problem. And I would do Zoom conferences often 3 times a day all over the world. It's just normal now, absolutely normal. But one thing that hasn't been said today is that you get great friends all over the world. So some of my best friends is the professor of childhood epilepsy in London. I have another very close friend in Switzerland, so America too. I have lots and lots of close friends who are like-minded people that are all over the world. So in fact, when I go to the conferences, and I travel far too much, it's like going out for a coffee with your best friend, because and sometimes I'll see Helen every 2 months somewhere, more than I see my friends at home. So, you know, that's not something that's quite come out. We've talked a lot about collaboration, but we haven't talked about how you make friends for life. And you do when you travel somewhere and you're with a group of fellows, and we heard that today from, I think Sharon mentioned that, but you really make fantastic friends for life, of like-minded people who've got their eye on the same ball, which is to improve outcomes.
May I just add something actually along those lines? And having been in Europe first, in North America, and observing Australians, and now being in Australia in a way, is that Australians do travel a lot. And, you know, when I was in Europe, in North America, this was enormously appreciated. You know, someone coming to a meeting, being on a flight for 25 hours, for example, and still be able to function to some degree at a meeting. And this is enormously appreciated by, I think, the rest of the world. That's in addition to Australians being friendly, but that's how you also network. You get a lot of things done by being in a meeting in person, and that's appreciated if you make the effort to be at that meeting, and that's how you make friends, that's how you build collaborations, and how you network. So the rest of the world does appreciate, I think, and this is an important point.
Yeah, but it's a hard balancing act. I mean, I just declined an invitation to Denmark last night after a lot of thought, but I've already got 4 trips to Europe in the first 6 months of next year. And, you know, there's only so much you can do, but this Denmark invitation was quite important in terms of a collaboration. So, you know, it's a constant balance. I think we probably have time for one more question, if there is one. Yes, at the front, Sarah.
Industry-funded research versus investigator-initiated, like getting grants, and how that has played a role in your own research or your careers?
Good question.
Certainly when I was a medical student, and even maybe an early resident, I remember the consultant saying never speak to the drug reps. And I think that has now changed, and well, certainly changed in diabetes/obesity world, such that we need funding from wherever we can get it. We still do need our research to be independent research, but I think probably over the last decade, my sense is that it has become more collaborative. So probably previously the battle line was drawn, and I don't see that so much now. I mean, ultimately, we are all, you know, going for patient care. So I think, yeah, definitely it is changing somewhat. But you don't want your research to be overtly influenced by the big drug companies, would be my thoughts.
I agree. I also grew up with the same impression. I mean, the industry was the dark force, but in reality, that's not the truth. Most of 99% of my research is investigator-initiated. Yet I'm trying to engage with the industry a bit more, because there are certain studies that are necessary, and they need the funding from the industry. And one has to keep the ability to think independently and not be influenced by the industry. But I think we need to engage with the industry anyways. To carry out studies which we would not be able as investigators to carry out otherwise. So I think there is also a shift in Nhmrc, and there is an increasing encouragement to engage with the industry, and this is viewed in a positive way.
I one of the many reasons why I did surgery was so I never had to prescribe many medications. So my interactions with drug companies is pretty limited. And paediatric surgery is such a small little field that, and most of the medication I use is lubricant. And nobody's beating down my door to come up with some new fancy lubricant. So I've got a very limited interaction with industry, I must say, which makes it easy because I don't have to, it's interesting, you go to the States and everybody's got their 5,000 disclosures that they have on their slides. But I don't have any of those.
It's a clinical trial run by the industry. It often has also clinical relevance, I think, so it's not automatically negative if you stay an independent researcher.
And my view is that the whole world shifted hugely and that we have to partner with industry. But you have to retain your integrity and you have to say, look, this isn't good enough. And I've recently had this a lot in the CBD, cannabidiol space, because cannabis is ruining my life in epilepsy. And some of the manufacturers are relatively dodgy and they come along and they want to do a trial and I say this isn't rigorous enough, I can't agree to this. But I'm doing about, 13 trials at the moment, and they're pharma-initiated. Then Sylvie's doing one with me that is investigator-initiated, our idea. But I think we have to engage with industry, and I think it's part of our day job now. And, we can't, Nhmrc isn't going to be able to afford all the science we need, and industry does. And you heard today about Nhmrc giving 1.5 million doses of something. So I think you have to do it, but you have to do it ethically and responsibly. So with that, I'm going to thank our panel. Please join me in thanking them. I think they've been fabulous.